organisation that is passionate about helping women progress and addressing the gender gap in financial and professional services. Our mission is to see more women thrive and grow and help them achieve success on their terms. But we also know that this conversation is bigger than gender and bigger than one industry. And that's why Tiffany Slater and I are going to broaden that conversation and bring you this diversity series with inspiring guests, different stories from different industries, yet with people all having faced similar challenges. Tiff, welcome. It's great to be back for part 2 of this series.
Thank you, Alex, and it's so exciting to have Andrew here today. We had Tane Drinkwater last week from the Brisbane Broncos sharing a bit of her personal journey, which was really inspiring. And next week we have Sam Bloom coming up, surfer, adventure traveller. She has a really personal story to share with you all that has brought Alex and I to tears when we've been speaking to her. So I really encourage everyone to register and join us for next week as well. But importantly, today we have Andrew Fraser. Very excited, Fraser. Fraser and I have worked together in the past, as you'll gather throughout the conversation. But I'll start with his formal introduction, and then Fraser will dive right in. So everyone, Andrew Fraser is a professional director and serves on a range of boards across different industry sectors. He has been Chair of Sunsuper since 2018 and is former Chair of the Investment Committee. He is an independent director of Watpac, New Zealand Rugby League and Motorsport Australia, and has advisory roles with EY and Griffith Enterprise. In addition to chairing Orange Sky Australia, Andrew also serves in other not-for-profit roles as a director of Third Space and the Hear and Say Centre. He is also a council member of Griffith University, where he is the chair of finance. Previously, he was the head of strategy and investment at the NRL and has served as director of the Rugby League World Cup and on the Australian Sports Commission. Andrew served as a minister in 2 governments, including as Treasurer of Queensland from 2007 to 2012. During his career in government, Andrew also held portfolios as Minister for State Development and Trade, Minister for Employment and Economic Development, and Minister for Local Government, Planning and Sport. He was appointed as Queensland's youngest Deputy Premier in 2011. A graduate of Griffith University, Andrew has a first-class honours degree in law and a Bachelor of Commerce and won the University Medal. So that's the formal bio. Fraser, let's talk a little bit about, from your perspective, who you are, and feel free to add in the highlight of your career to date, which was working with me.
Yeah, I didn't realise you were going to read out that long list. But yeah, I was going to say that the most important part was that I'm Tiffany Slater's former boss.
You can only hope that it can get better than that at some point.
Well, I'm not sure who was actually managing who at that point, but that's probably a good topic for today.
It is. So before we dive into diversity, is there anything else you want to tell us about your life, your career and your experience that wasn't in that formal bio?
No, I think the only other part which is missing from kind of a long roll call list is I grew up in North Queensland, still live in Brisbane these days, and as of last week, I'm the owner of a teenager with a learner's licence, which I think is possibly my biggest professional challenge to date.
Andrew, now I haven't had the pleasure of working with you, so I would like to know a bit more about the journey thus far. I mean, did you set out to achieve that long list of accomplishments? Was politics something that always was always in your vision? Like, share a bit of the story with us.
Yeah, I mean, I was always interested in politics. I did think it was something that would happen much later in life. I kind of presumed that politics was something that happened to 60-year-old blokes in some kind of non-connected sense. And so politics probably happened a bit earlier for me than might have been in any kind of life plan. But the real, I suppose the real story I would share is I have actually just pursued things that have been of interest and that I felt strongly about, rather than trying to live a life planned out to some kind of strategic plan on a career chart. Others do that, and that's fair enough, but I haven't done it, and it's probably worked out for the best so far.
And so what's that look like? Because that completely resonates with me as well. Not that I've achieved anything like what you have, but in terms of not having this linear plan, I remember way back when I got old enough to actually be invited to grad things where they wanted to know how I'd planned out my career, and just how disappointed all these young people were that I didn't say, well, I went from A to B. I kind of went, well, I don't know, it's kind of organic, and I was open to opportunities. Like, is that similar for you, that you were open to the next opportunity and jumped in?
Yeah, I think you've got to be open. I think sometimes also you don't. One of the things I've done, I should say, is actually gone to people in areas that I've been interested in and flagged that. And I think one of the things that happens now is because we all have public CVs via LinkedIn profiles, everyone kind of holds them up like, menus that you might look at it online for a restaurant. And it kind of denies the reality that for some people, they should be non-linear and take account of all the things that happen outside of a working life. So you've got to adjust to both personal circumstances, but also your interests, I think.
And you have obviously some personal interest in sport, which has seen you take on some roles. And then lately you've had some director positions, both in the for-profit and the not-for-profit sector. Can you tell us a little bit about that shift?
Yeah, so being interested in sport, my contribution was always going to be on this side of the white line rather than out there in the middle. And, that's part of knowing what you're good at is accepting that. So I wanted to be a Formula One driver, but it's never going to happen. So it turns out I'm much better sitting at a Motorsport Australia board table. Not probably as exciting, but in my view, still just as important. I think overall, what I've tried to do is balance out the things that pay the bills with the things where you can also make a difference. And if they coincide, then you're in a fortunate position, and I think I am in that fortunate position. But I do purposely allocate a chunk of my time to doing unpaid work in the charity sector because I feel like I'm in a position to do that, and therefore I should. Not everyone is in that position, and I'd fully acknowledge that, but I am, and so therefore I should.
And I guess that's one of the things we talk about, Alex and I are really passionate about in this wider conversation of systemic change. Everybody has a role to play. And to your point, for you at this stage, it's on potentially in boardrooms, but for others, it might not be that, and everyone has a position, and we want to encourage that. Let's dive right into the fact that you've had a bunch of leadership roles throughout your career. So leading a state, leading the strategic direction of the NRL, and leading in boardrooms. What are your thoughts on the role of leadership specifically in the diversity conversation?
So I think probably one of the most significant things that happened to me in my career was Queensland's first female premier picked me as a 30-year-old to be a treasurer. And I joked with her at the time. One of the unusual things about politics is we were good friends and remain good friends. But as she said, by the end of the day that she picked me as treasurer, no one noticed that Queensland had its first female premier. It was a big call to pick someone so young. But the more important and non-joking point I would make about that is the most significant vote of confidence, the really big leap of faith that anyone ever took in me was in fact by a woman. And working for a really strong, intelligent female leader was the formative experience of my early career. The first big job I had, I reported to a pretty formidable leader who happened to be the first female premier of Queensland. And so that to me taught me about backing people irrespective of what it said on the tin. So you should actually pick the person, not pick the cookie cutter. And sometimes it's really hard for organisations to take risks on people. It's much easier to hire the person who did the job at the competitor or who's got the absolute runs on the board, or to try and create the perfect role description and then fit the person in. I've always been a bit more people-centric in the way that I've tried to focus on the people to have around, and that is, if the person's got the capability, the skills and the insight, then go with that rather than any other formulaic response.
Andrew, I'm fascinated to understand more about this as well, because I think, Tiff, as you were just saying, I mean, the whole purpose of this series is to broaden the conversation from just gender, and to really, because the thing is, you know, as we've said to you already, Andrew, when we were doing the promo, you know, it's bigger than one industry, it's bigger than just gender. And I loved how, to paraphrase you were talking about, you know, it's got to, organisations, if we're really going to shift the dial, because I think we must have all been talking about, there's no shortage of data and reports, and they all kind of still say the same thing, and nothing really seems to be moving. And I love how you were talking about it's got to be deeper than tick, you know, kind of a tick the box approach. You know, a diversity and inclusion team or committee or program isn't going to cut it. And we got into talking about, you know, what diversity means to you, and are you happy to go into a bit more
Sure.
depth into that?
Yeah, so I think the reason that diversity is of benefit to organisations, and all those reports which you've talked about all point to this, is that cognitive dissonance, different ways of thinking and different ways, different perspectives are actually really powerful in getting to a better answer. So none of us working alone by ourselves, however clever we are sitting in a room by ourselves with the door shut to the world, are going to have the full perspective or the data inputs or the range of considerations that a truly diverse group of people will have. And I think when organisations know diversity, see it and experience, and see how it produces better decisions, then it becomes easier to advocate for the inputs of diversity. So that is making sure that we've got people from different genders, different backgrounds, different cultural experiences, different experiences growing up, so that you don't just have that ticker box diversity which says, yes, you know, we've hit a gender target, job done, put the queue in the rack. It's about the ongoing quest to make sure you've got different perspectives represented at decision-making tables and inputting into decisions, because if you experience the power of diversity, you have to be a fan of it.
And so if you are listening to this and you understand the theory of, you know, diversity can bring about better decision making, and if you've had that experience, that probably makes it easier. But if it's quite conceptual at this point to some people, what, you know, and admitting that cognitive dissonance can feel uncomfortable, and probably a gut reaction is to move away from it and minimize it, what would you encourage people to do or think about as they're approaching cognitive dissonance with the aim of achieving diversity?
I think people at an individual level, and this doesn't require anyone else to do anything, but ask yourself the counterfactual. So if what I'm thinking isn't right, what might be the opposite? What might be the opposite conclusion? And that's, if you like, a soft way of introducing yourself to the concept that if you're really sure and comfortable because everyone's saying the same thing, in fact, here's the big orange light in the control room, that's the reason you should be worried. I say when I join boards to executive teams, my starting point is implicit trust in the management team. The first time I question that is the management team or the individual executive who comes to the board table and says, everything is great, there's nothing to worry about. Because in every organisation, there's things to worry about, and the people sitting at the board table with the big jobs, with the senior executive roles, are paid to worry about stuff. So I think getting people comfortable with the idea that there are things to worry about and there are things that should make you feel uncomfortable is the first step.
Mm.
How do you and I love that you've introduced the board table, because there's so much to go into here. I mean, whether it's an exec or a leadership team, and obviously a lot of this community, I mean, they're leaders of other human beings and they work in all sorts of organisations. Groupthink is a very real thing. And obviously it's related to what we're talking about now. I mean, in your experience, Andrew, I mean, where have you seen groupthink kind of creep up on a leadership team, and how can we guard against that? Because you're right, it kind of happens. And I think to your point, Tiff, it's this bit where we don't realise it, that it's already happened, but we're feeling very comfortable with each other and everyone's kind of agreeing, and, you know, suddenly it goes from groupthink to reality. So, Andrew, from your perspective, so I guess, you know, as a leader in any of the rooms that you've sat in or sit in today, how do you guard against groupthink, and how do you keep introducing this concept of diversity of thought and being uncomfortable and challenging the status quo?
So one of my rules at the board table is growth forgives many sins. or you might say success forgives many sins. So lots of organisations can be successful and can be churning out the numbers and getting the accolades. But the challenge is always, and generally what I would share at the board table, is what are our competitors thinking, or what are the people who rely on us thinking? And they're not going to be sitting around going, great set of numbers, great industry recognition, tick, tick and tick. They're going to be restless and looking to either, in a commercial sense, eat the lunch of the organisation, or in a broader sense, otherwise seek to provide what that organisation's purpose is. And so actually always imploring your colleagues to think about what can be done better rather than just wallowing in self-congratulation is the first kind of barrier, first line of defence to groupthink. But I think if you have to really work hard at advocating for diversity of thought at the board table, then you've got the input wrong. You don't have the right people sitting around. And when I've seen really high-performing boards and groups of people, there is inevitably a diversity of background, not just through one lens, gender or otherwise, that's represented at the table. And it just forces everyone, as they push the boat off from the jetty in their first thought, to be aware and cognizant of different perspectives. And that's a great intellectual discipline.
If we think about on a really personal level, so when you walk into a boardroom and when you indeed walked into the I guess the deputy premier role and as treasurer, youngest treasurer, you were in some respects a stat. And a lot of the conversations we have, Alex and I have had personal conversations where we have walked into rooms and we've been a stat. So we might be the only woman in a room, or we might be the youngest, or we might have a background in XYZ. And I'm sure a lot of people on this listening will also feel like a stat at some point. What do you think from a personal perspective is really important to have around you, where you feel like you're walking into something where you are the different one, to give you the courage and the almost like the fight in you to keep going?
Look, I'm not going to tick many diversity boxes apart from, as you said, back in those days, I was often the youngest person in the room and by a chunk. And so, politics, like commerce, is a competitive business, not just internally, but externally as well. And there was no doubt that a lot of people, would have relished the idea that the 30-year-old kid would hit the fence and, maybe hit the fence spectacularly and create good fodder for cartoonists and all those sort of things. So to answer your question about how to overcome that, the most important things for me were I had a number of people who I knew had my back and who I could go and ask for views or to test thinking or know that if I was going to take a wrong step or, put the foot in the wrong direction, that they would be there to kind of guide back. And for me, that was, not only Anna as a leader, but a range of other people who were all a chunk older than me, but who were generous in their time. And that really made a difference to me in that role and subsequently. And as such, the thing I try and do sometimes at request and sometimes proactively is provide that kind of support to a group of younger people who I've worked with or come across over time. And I do that because it was so beneficial to me. And I feel like because I got the benefit of it, I should give the benefit of that back. And it's up to the people who sometimes ask or don't ask for that advice, like you, Slats, to decide whether or not that's a good thing.
As my father says, I offer advice, it's up to you what you do with it.
Exactly. I say it's provided for free, so you may place an equal value on it.
It's appreciated regardless of how we respond, right?
Yeah, exactly. And besides, I'm a former politician in the exile land of the defeated. So, telling people what to do was part of how I used to earn a cross. So people like you get to listen now.
Very fortunate.
And we enjoy and appreciate it. So, Andrew, the thing I want to get a bit deeper into, so it's great, so far we've sort of talked a bit about you and starting to unveil a bit about behind the scenes of your experiences and all those sort of things. I'd love to get your perspective as a man on on this conversation around diversity and inclusion, because one of the things that we're really passionate about is that it's not this conversation, you know, from a gender lens, it's not just about women. Like, we've got to have men and women and different groups working together. And I think this is one of the things that I think Tiffany and I sort of latched onto when we met and started talking about a bigger conversation, is that there's lots of, you know, groups that kind of seem to almost, you know, compete against each other, saying that they're, you know, they want to achieve the same thing. And when we're very much about having a bigger conversation and working together. And for me, I think, you know, having men included in this conversation is incredibly important for a number of reasons. What are your thoughts and I guess your experience as well as a man around being part of these conversations?
Look, I mean, we'd all like to think that everyone's signed up to the enlightened view, but of course the reality is that not everyone is. And so I think what I've always tried to do is, if there's ever a circumstance where I feel like it's not on the table, is the way to introduce it is by asking a question. And that is, how do we think about this in terms of that? Or this list of appointees is notable for being completely one-sided in terms of gender. What are we doing about whether or not we can get people from different backgrounds on this list? And just asking the question, a lot of times where diversity is not valued, or it hasn't, or the diversity benefit is not part of the way organisations think, it's because people have been avoiding the question. And so if you're a director, you know, has generally been my experience, asking the question is in fact the best way to start it, because that's something that that ultimately you can do. But look, you know, I think one of the things is organisations should look at where they play. And for mine, the NRL, where Slats and I work together, it's one of the few walks of life where Indigenous Australians are positively over-indexed. You know, from 2% and a bit of the population to generally the elite team, the national team, will have more than 10% Indigenous players and a whole lot of other different cultural diversity above that. And often the leaders of the game have been Indigenous leaders, which is very different to many other walks of life in Australian society. And so that means, I think, that the NRL should be an absolute leader at the forefront of having Indigenous people working in the business. It should have not just an Indigenous employment target that matches population like many other organisations have, but it should massively over-index. And that, I think, is an important point about not just trying to meet the de minimis standard, but actually look at your own organisation, look at where you play, and look at where you can over-index rather than just meet the minimum.
So the idea of a stretch goal, almost, of not simply ticking the box and going, this is the target that'll get us across the line, public facing, whatever it is, but saying, hang on, how can we make a difference here? And how can we push ourselves and our thinking? Is there a point where potentially in the boardroom, but also at an individual level, that the amount of change that we think should be achieved or could be achieved is overwhelming, and we don't really know where to step next?
Look, I think when people come to that conclusion, it's because of organisational fatigue rather than my perspective, which is, you know, there's never a good day to give up on this stuff. There's always a good day to do something else. And so, you know, it starts with when you get another recruitment firm bowling you up 9 blokes and 1 woman for a significant leadership role, going back and saying, make sure there's better balance on the candidate list. And you just have to stay at the wheel, because it's so easy for things to just flop back into their previous form or their kind of natural state of being that you need to press on.
So just to pick that point, yeah, I completely agree, Andrew. So just to keep pulling this thread a bit more. So because what you're describing in that, just that simple example, and I imagine you do see it, you know, with all the work you do as an independent director and as a chair, you know, when you're getting candidates for those sorts of positions as well, that different groups, not just women, aren't equally represented as options. What do you think that, I guess, structurally or in systems that we're seeing that is really still putting these obstacles in the way? Because it was interesting, Tiff, remember last week when we were chatting to Tane, and she talked about a lot of great things, but she really eloquently talked about, the need for systems and behaviours and symbols to align to really start, moving the dial properly. So in your experience, talk to us a bit about where you potentially, but why are there still these obstacles? Why are still not a diverse group of candidates being presented for roles? Is it that people are hanging back? Like, what do you see structurally that is preventing this from happening?
I think most hiring, whether it's done through external processes or internal processes, is reasonably risk averse. People in their own careers who are doing the hiring, to the extent that they're going to spend any of their inverted commas risk capital in an organisation, it's probably not going to be on an out-of-the-box hire. And so if you look at the way organisations operate, they'll generally hire by degrees of difference rather than orders of magnitude of difference. And very rare is the cross-pollination from one industry to another, or a transfer leap from subject matter expertise in one area to another. And I think having a conversation in organisations about whether or not that's leaving some people out of the hiring universe is a way to address that. It's much easier said than done, but it's, to use a kind of tactical or particular example, I've certainly been party to decisions in the past where a recruitment process is undertaken and it ultimately doesn't quite find the one person, but it might find the two people. And then for reimagining what you're actually after and grabbing those two people can be a better option. But it takes support from the top to do that.
Absolutely. And it comes back to, your question, Tiff, about leadership, I think, is that this is one of the roles that leaders have to play. You've got to show by example that this is okay. I mean, just when you were talking, Andrew, you're right. I like how you said, people will only, what did you say, have, put a certain amount of their risk capital in an organisation. And this is where I think it's pervasive, isn't it? Because you think that, you're pro, you're at the wheel, you're doing all this thing, but underneath, if you step too far out of what everyone else is doing, there's a risk that I think a lot of leaders would feel, whether they're conscious or not. And it just reminded me of, you find someone who doesn't fit the box or the norm, and it's almost like then everyone's looking at you to go, see, you went out on a limb here and look what happened. It's almost, if you felt that, it was actually almost reminded me when you were saying that Anna took a chance on you and everyone was kind of sitting back waiting to see the 30-year-old go, well, that was kind of a foolish appointment. Like, is it that kind of pervasiveness that you think's out there still?
Yeah, I think overall hiring practices are reasonably incremental and conservative. And I guess the question that really good leaders are asking themselves who are in positions of power is, in the face of such change that's all around us, is that going to get us to where we need to be? And if you think that the management task or the strategy task at the organisation is achievable by increments, by optimising 1% and by adjusting the sales by 1 or 2 degrees, then it probably says that your hiring practices should adjust by the same increment. If you think that the forces of change around your organisation are bigger than that, then it probably suggests you should also think about the way that you're hiring and promoting and getting talent into the organisation. And if the two don't line up, then potentially you're going to find that you're adrift in a sea of change without the sort of people that you need to confront the dynamic environment around you.
And this is the thing, when we're facing times of change like we are now, and we potentially feel, we're trying to take that leap and be thoughtful and encourage diversity and encourage cognitive dissonance. If we feel like we're standing alone in that, you've talked about having mentors and how that can help people have your back and people guide you and advise when you potentially misstep. What other support structures do you think are important to back you? But then equally, for people who may not be chairs of boards or on boards or in the CEO position, but are leaders of teams, what can they do as individuals to start to shift the dial that are really practical tips?
Look, I think at every level of every organisation, actually voicing how you value diversity and how different ways of thinking actually create a better decision, and concentrating on the outcome, the output of what diversity brings, is the way to start the conversation. Not everyone's in a position where they're hiring the next CEO, but even if you're the manager of 6 people, if at the start of the team meeting, you're talking about what we want here is different ways of thinking, what we want here is different perspectives, and something that, you know, I've done on occasion, and you may have a fond or a non-fond memory of this back in the day, but is to get someone else to be the case against. So say, all right, we've all sat here and said, we think the direction of travel is this. Let's get so-and-so and so-and-so to say why that's not the case. And even though it doesn't change what actually probably is the right decision, it actually forces you to think about the other path, and it just promotes people being able to say, well, this is the alternative view, which makes them more comfortable offering a genuinely alternative view in the future, rather than thinking that the name of the successful meeting is everyone stands up and applauds the group decision by acclamation at the end.
And so, okay, so to extend that even more, and we're going to dive in, potentially go into an area that you love talking about, which is feelings. What's the, you know, to be able to do that genuinely is it's up to the room, probably the leader, to create a safe space. So there's trust, psychological safety, to be able to challenge each other and know that it's not going to harm relationships, or people are going to be left feeling like they're standing alone with no one having their back. So how can we, I guess, is that the first step to creating discussion where diversity is celebrated or welcome? Is it about trust and psychological safety, and what is the role of the leader in that?
So in some of the places I'm involved in, we use a concept of respectful challenge. So, which is basically the permission to say, actually, from my perspective, I think X and Y as opposed to A and B. And where it works is where that is just so normal, that it's not like, you know, a passive aggressive with all due respect, which, you know, the minute someone says that, you know, that they actually have no respect for what you're thinking or saying whatsoever. But that concept where it is just normal, and it, as you say, it has to be granted from the top. But if you start with the proposition that diverse thinking gets a better outcome, and that it's a valued input, regardless of who says it, or regardless of the topic, then you just get more comfortable with different views and people being able to discern the pathway out of that.
So as much we're saying a lot of this change is dependent upon the leader and the leader's position, there is obviously the role for the rest of the team, whatever title, whatever, wherever they sit in the hierarchy, to engage in that and to take up the invitation to respectfully challenge, as you say.
Yeah, and I think the thing I would say to everyone who may not be in a position of leadership, who's thinking about this from a perspective where they're not in that powerful position, is the way to prove that you can and should be a leader in the future is to put forward a view that may not be the group thing. That the way that you help break down the barrier in front of you, which whether it's an absolute brick wall or something kind of more submissive or subversive, I should say, is to actually say, well, what about this idea X? And I would say if the organisation or the people around you are really going to shoot you down for that, then that probably tells you a lot about the organisation and a little less about you as a person. So it's hard, and I'm not underestimating how hard it is, but I would say to everyone, you know, really good leaders and really good organisations respect people who are willing to put forward a different view.
Yeah, I love that. And you're right. I think it's good that you've called out as well, Andrew, that it's that distinction between, it's not that, and it is passive aggressive, isn't it? It's, you know, it's the, oh, with all due respect, it's that I think we can tell the difference. So it's genuinely hearing and listening other people's views and giving them consideration. I think it just reminds me, as you're talking, you know, we get a lot of leaders that talk about having cultures that are more entrepreneurial, you know, in terms of business, more entrepreneurial, and it's easy to, you know, it's okay to fail. And I think we all know that it's one thing to say it's okay to fail, but if you don't have exactly really what you're talking about here is the leadership, the safety that you're talking about, Tiff, where people genuinely feel okay to challenge and that it is okay. It's one thing to say and another thing to do entirely, I think.
Yeah.
I'd love to know, sorry, Tiff, I'm just curious because, Andrew, I mean, you've had so much experience, and you do have so much experience across lots of different industries, even with your directorships and your chair and sport and motorsport and politics. I mean, are there any particular fields, or even outside of those, that you think are really having a powerful conversation about diversity and inclusion and are being brave and pushing it more than others that you can share?
So one of the roles I have is on the governing body of my university, Griffith University, and I think Griffith is doing a good job in this space. It's had a history and a culture of being slightly different, and so I think that makes it a bit easier to potentially think about this in different ways. But one of the things I would say about my overall experience of this is the breadth of organisations that I'm attached to is kind of like a case in point about why diversity works. So what should connect a professional sport in another country to a charity providing support to homeless people in Brisbane, or a superannuation fund for 1.4 million Australians? You know, the answer is not a lot. But it's amazing how the different ideas and challenges and perspectives can cross-pollinate the thinking on how you solve different problems at different organisations. And, you know, for me, I probably get bored too easily, so I need to be connected to a lot of different things to get that kind of satisfaction. But what it really does, the insight for me, is that diversity of exposure to issues, industries, and different modes of operating, whether for-profit or not, actually really cross-pollinates and creates the powerful mix. And if that powerful mix works at a macro level for how I spend my time, then that same principle applies about how to get a better decision sitting in any one organisation or any one team.
Yeah, so what is really clear from what you talk about diversity is you have personal experience, so whether it's being selected under ANA and or if it's now, as you say, having a range and diversity of interests and discussions, that's helping you to think about things differently and then bring that to the next table that you're at.
Yeah, totally. And I think, you know, at the super fund I chair and at the university, I'm a member of the governing body of, those structures have inbuilt mechanisms to provide people from different backgrounds, whether, you know, superannuation is constructed on having people from the employer side and the employee side. And, you know, here's the newsflash: they don't generally think the same thing first thing in the morning when they read the newspaper, but it's kind of structural forced cognitive dissonance. Universities have students and staff members, and not just academic staff, but other staff who are structurally mandated to be part of governing bodies who bring a different perspective. And when you've had those experiences of seeing how different perspectives add into the mix and get to a better outcome, then it's much easier to embrace what diversity can give rather than be afraid of it. It's not a stalking horse for another kind of secret agenda. It's actually just a better way to get a better decision.
Yeah, so it's a vicious cycle. It's if you are able to experience it, either by being open to opportunities or being afforded opportunities, and it's a positive experience, then you are more likely, hopefully, to then encourage that in another space and give other people that experience.
I mean, who wants to go to a dinner party where everyone talks about topic du jour and says, oh, yeah, I agree the same thing? Like, you know, it's kind of a bit boring.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't want to have the complete numpty at the end who's, you know, kind of starting a fight about everything. But the idea of Socratic dialogue, where people offer different perspectives and iterate an idea, you know, it's kind of been around for a few thousand years, and maybe there's something in it.
Absolutely. I have to ask before we let you go. So we've already picked up on that we both are kind of keen on motorsport, which Tiff's like, oh God, how do we get more women in motorsport? What's going on there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So one of the things we're doing is appointing women to the board of Motorsport Australia. So we have 2 women on the board now, and we've also implemented a women's commission inside Motorsport Australia, which is getting people who are involved in the industry and some who aren't to promote participation in the industry, because if nothing else, from a pure kind of commercial perspective, leaving 51% of the marketplace to one side is kind of a bit dumb. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you don't have to have actually a postdoctoral thesis in gender studies to agree that leaving 51% of the marketplace outside of your commercial environment is pretty dumb. The NRL understands that. It's probably not executing on as well as it should be, to say the very, very least. But here's the news flash for anyone who otherwise wants to discount the importance. Women make up 51% of the marketplace. So if your business is good enough to survive on the 49%, good luck to you.
You're right. There are just so many examples. Well, I really look forward to seeing those developments myself as an avid motorsport fan. Hey, Andrew, thanks so much. As Tiff, you and I always say, time goes so fast on these conversations, and before you know it, it's nearly 1:45. Before we let you go, Andrew, I mean, we've covered so much ground, and you've given us lots of practical tips. But just for our audience, are there, where would you like to leave this conversation in terms of a role that we can all play, the next steps that we can play, just really small things that, regardless of what position you are or what industry you're in, a step that everyone, you know, from your experience could take today to really start pushing the boundaries of this conversation?
I guess, look, it's an incremental step, but what I think is good about it is that everyone can do it, and that is to pose the counterfactual. So in whatever conversation, just say, all right, before we make this decision, why is the opposite decision not right? And it means that the person who puts it forward doesn't have to own it, doesn't have to advocate it. It's an exercise in a discipline of thinking to say, we should think about the alternative course, or think about what we're missing and why someone else would make a different decision. And that just introduces that concept of uncomfortable thinking that, you know, is the kind of forebear to diverse thinking, which I think is what really drives really great organisations. It's not a homogenous world, it's a diverse world, and our thinking needs to match the world.
Totally agree. And I think helping alleviate ourselves of feeling like it's a personal agenda or a personal responsibility and that we're carrying it alone will hopefully give people confidence to keep asking the question, as you say.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew and Tiff. It's been another great episode in our diversity series. Andrew, thanks for being part of a big conversation, and all the very best with having a learner driver in your household now.
Yeah, that's some diversity that's actually not working for me.
Yeah. We're all being stretched.
The same piece of wisdom you've just given all of us, you can now apply to that scenario yourself. But thanks, mate. Really appreciate it. It's been great to chat. Thanks as always, Tiff. And thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. The diversity series, anyone that you'd like to see coming up, we're all ears. Don't miss next Tuesday with Sam Bloom. It's going to be a really amazing conversation with Sam. I think we already know that, Tiff, don't we?
We do. Thank you, Fraser, and thank you, Alex, for another great conversation.
Nice. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.